So we'll start on next generation lithography. We have discussed lithography. We have seen how the basic idea of designing a layout of a chip and then transferring that onto a wafer surface. So that was what is just lithography. But now what we'll be talking is next generation lithography, the ideas that have been developed or have evolved, where we really want to make things at nanoscale. We want to write things at nanoscale with. So there are few things that we want to achieve when we say we want to write things at nanoscale. We want to meet certain criteria, certain requirements. So just to recap, photolithography or optical lithography is we make the layout, we have multi-layer design, we make masks, we call them photomasks because we use light to transfer pattern on the surface, and the mask is just a glass plate which has transparent and opaque regions. And so one lithography step we remove the photoresist wherever the pattern is, we do the process, etching, deposition, whatever needs to be done, and then we come back, we use the next mask, right? So we do layered steps until we develop or write all the parts of those devices that are supposed to go on the surface, right? The basic of lithography. The idea is that we use light source when we do photolithography. And then with those relationships, Rayleigh's criterion and things, we saw that we can push down the wavelength of the light that we use and we can make smaller features, right? And so there were three important criteria that we are looking, which was minimum feature size, how small, how close can we make things, what we call pitch, and depth of focus, that how much can be the topographical difference in the height. Now, when we are talking about multi-layered mask or multi-layered device parameters or characteristics, so we want to stay in focus as much as we can. But what happened in that discussion, we saw that if lambda goes too small, the energy of the photons goes up. When energy goes up, that becomes a problem, because when we are using optical lenses, we are using all tricks to keep our light focus. That high energy becomes problematic, that now we start messing up with the device, with the system itself. So damage to optics and absorption and all those things start coming up. So we have to keep on pushing, and we can get to 150, 200 nanometers just with playing with the light source. There are a couple of tricks that are used in optical lithography that we then go into immersion lithography, where we use, instead of using vacuum or air, we use liquids to change the index of the medium. Or there are some techniques where we play with the feature size, so we add some extra areas. So we skipped on that. Just to goal was to get into next generation lithography. So challenges in optical lithography, we have put those things down. So when we make on the right side corner, so when we make things smaller, we have less tolerance. So we have less room for error, because now things become too close to each other. And of course, the cost goes up, and we can achieve somewhere 150 to 200 nanometer with UV. Now we talk about next generation lithography. So next generation lithography, we'll talk about trying to keep on pushing the wavelengths down. So that would be what we call extreme UV. And we get into the range of X-rays. And that's one thing. And on the right side, I've listed electron beam lithography and focused ion beam lithography. And then there are variations of that, which is electron projection and ion projection. But We'll look at the basic concepts, and they are pretty much, very much similar. And then we have what I've written here, scanning probe lithography. So scanning probe lithography is something where we use a kind of a, a very sharp tip, very sharp nib, if you can call it, to write things. So that tip has to be very sharp, right? So if it's sharp, it can write smaller features. And then towards the end of this module, we'll go into soft lithography, which is we take the word lithography from this concept of transferring the patterns, but we will be dealing with soft materials and writing in soft materials directly. Because those soft materials, or what you call polymers, you can call them plastics, but polymer is more appropriate. We use them to create lab-on-chip devices, right? We have seen examples of lab-on-chip. For example, PCR on chip. So that chip, the lower part was hard, but you have to put the soft, transparent, plasticky material or polymers on top to create channels, to create valves, to push around liquids to do sensing or whatever was the goal of that biochip that we were using. So that would be soft lithography. And then another special type of lithography, what we call nano imprint lithography. So that's this module and a few more things that we do. So now from this idea of lithography, we can get data. And there was this gentleman, Tennant. He was a gentleman who worked in lithography area in Bell Labs, and then he was at Cornell nanoscale facility. So he brought together data from so many years on finding trend of how things have evolved when we do direct writing, right? So direct writing is that instead of projecting light, we are taking those electron beam or ion beam to directly write and resist. What we used to call photoresist, now we would call it electron beam resist or ion beam resist. So we just call it resist. So when I say resist, that will mean that covering of the polymer in which we write whatever feature needs to be written. So he gathered this data that how resolution and aerial throughput has changed. So he found that there is a power relationship. So you see the both axes are logarithmic, right? So which is, we call it power relationship. So exponential dependence on both sides. What we see here is that we want to have smaller and smaller resolution, right? So which would mean we want to come down, and this plot brings you to the lower left side. But when we make resolution small, what's happening is throughput, aerial throughput, which means how fast can we write? So if I'm device manufacturer, I want to make things smaller, yeah, of course. But if instead of making 10 chips or if making 1,000 chips in a day, you say I can only make 100 chips a day, which means my productivity has gone down by an order of 10. So that's throughput there, because you cannot now flood the whole chip surface like we do with optical lithography. Instead of that, now you have to write each feature with that E-beam or ion beam or scanning probe, whatever things we use. We'll look at all of those. So this is now the challenge that we, on resolution side, we want to stay down, but on the throughput side, we want to be on the right side, right? We want to have higher throughput, but that's not our plot is showing. So plot, you see the best fit, which is given R equals 23 times T to the power 0.2, that's the power relationship. We want to do something that we can have technology on this side, this should be this way, and this side, this should be this way, which is, if I just plot it down, I would say that we want to be in this place. That's a sweet place that we all want to be. So does it make sense? We want to make things smaller, but we want to make them fast and fast. So throughput becomes a major problem. Throughput becomes a major question when we talk about next generation lithography or other techniques which are not parallel, right? Does it make sense when I say they're not parallel? Because we are not flooding the whole chip. We have to write one by one. So the wish list is that we want to move to the bottom right-hand corner, right? But that wish would come at a cost. We need to invest in tools. We need to change processes, recipes. We have to characterize and find out the best recipes using existing tools, which takes money. But it's always going to be a penalty on how fast we can do, right? So if I were to make a wish list like what is an ideal system you want to do? So there'll be throughput issues, there'll be resolution issues, there'll be, I don't want to invest too much. I want to maintain high quality, which means I don't want to have defective devices when we finish the whole process. Or if I have defective devices, I want to have equipment or ways that I can look for those defects early on, which becomes challenging when we are making things smaller. Now, I want to automate, which means I want to have equipment and system that can detect those anomalies, or during the process that can set up things right. So which means precision in robotics. So it's a whole bunch of things that we can do. And when we make things too small, we reach the physical limitations. For example, we have talked about transistor and the thin area where we do oxide called gate oxide. If you make it too small, too thick, it stops being an insulator. And yeah, it is an insulator, but then the current starts tunneling through oxide. And tunneling is a major failure mechanism, right? Tunneling where the current is not supposed to flow, it flows because now things have become too small. So we start hitting the quantum limits of things that we keep on pushing them down, but they start breaking because we are reaching their physical limitations. You're with me? I don't see too many videos. Many folks have turned their videos on, so I don't get visual cues from your side that understood. All right, so with this wish list, there's been lots of push, and this is work from last 20, 25 years. And it's still continuing, where we want to have parallelization over large area, which means that we don't want to make things one by one, but we want to have some way of making them all together. But that becomes a problem, and we'll discuss some of the things, what are the issues there. We want to do fast writing so we can have high throughput, and the issue of alignment, because when things become too small from one chip to the next chip, when we are going, we want to align to the small feature from the previous step. So next step becomes a little bit challenging how we can do that. So that's another issue of alignment when we go too small in size. Now, there is cost effectiveness, which is related to if there are defects and the chip size is size. So we need to have equipment or metrics where we can match them with standards, and we can image them, or maybe we can do testing, electrical testing, whatever testing needs to be done. Those need to be done. There is a message. Can you? So that's where next generation lithography, or what you call next gen lithography, comes in. So extreme UV, we get into soft X-rays, right? And when you say soft X-rays, we are talking about wavelengths, which is very highly energetic, kilo electron volts. We were discussing the quartz has 8 electron volts band gap energy, right? And now we are talking about kilo electron volts, which means they would just pass through glass. X-rays pass through human tissue. X-rays pass through many things, right? So now, how do we make the pattern out of them? How do we make a stencil where we shine X-rays and the stencil can be opaque, right? So that's a challenge there. Now, PXL is proximity X-ray lithography, which means we are keeping the mask close to the surface where the things need to be written, which means now the design has to be of the same size. We cannot do that. Remember, we were talking about micro copy type of thing. You can write, you can have a bigger image, but once you condense it down, we can get a sharper image. But now with X-rays, it has to be now, whatever feature needs to be written on the mask has to be the final size that we want. We keep on pushing, we get into hard X-rays, which is 0.1 nanometer. Yeah, we can have very small features theoretically, but the problem is too much energy. The energy is too high and problems of mass comes in. So now we know that when we get to this energy 10 or less kilo electron volt, we want to have the absorption of those waves. So they can change or undergo, the photoresist can undergo chemical changes. But if they don't absorb, they keep on passing through, photoresist will not get exposed. So, or if we do that, they result into impact ionization of atoms in the photoresist, which means they would result into a bigger feature. The exposure area will increase because now they are causing an impact with the atoms of photoresist and causing a flood of electrons, causing change in photoresist in a bigger area. So I just made a cartoon here that, yeah, it's rock and hard place, which means which way do I go? If I make the wavelength too small, I have the problem of secondary electrons. For example, if ideally they would go straight and do something like this one, we are okay with that. But what they do is they cause secondary electrons, which would mean that feature size is this much, but what gets projected is bigger than that. So you end up having a bigger feature size. So,
Sir, could you repeat how does this happen exactly? Because of the Len law, Lenset law.
no, Tennant's law was just about the idea that we keep on trying to push resolution smaller, but that causes throughput to go higher.
Okay.
That was
So why
the
does this?
Tennant law.
Oh, Tenet law. Okay. So why does this happen, sir? This
X-rays have high energy. They have they have a phenomena called impact ionization. When they strike,
Oh, I know.
they have too
The
much
strike
energy.
big. Continue.
You got it? So they have too much energy. They transfer their energy to other electrons. They cause electrons to become high energy. So they cause the photoresist to undergo changes, which means the feature was supposed to be this small, but because of the impact ionization, the feature was supposed to be this much. What you get is this much because this one, I'm just showing as an example, one interaction, which is supposed to happen here, have resulted into all these waves and caused so many electrons to get flooded. So you get something like this. Bringing my wavelengths down gives me smaller capability to create smaller feature size, but they carry too much energy. And that becomes a problem for to have a resist, right? So this is showing penetration depth here in the table above. Extreme UV in gold can go into 50 nanometer. In silicon, they can go 600 nanometer. So they penetrate metal as well. They penetrate hard material as well, right? X-ray. But in the case of X-rays, this is thousands of nanometer, which is they would just pass through the wafer. And even if they don't, they would cause this kind of expansion of the desired feature. So becomes a problem that how much uh, wavelength can you push down? All right, students, get your video feed on. I cannot see you. It becomes, Maria, I asked you to remind them to turn their video feed on. You know, you can push these 3 buttons. When you push it down, there is a button that says ask to start video. Maria, are you with us? Maria, are you with us? Maria Kaleem? I think she's not here. She just logged in. So what? So mask membrane or mask material has to be thick. The film that we use, that has to be thick. So it puts other requirements on what can we do. So extreme UV lithography, although it's an extension of projection lithography, but there has to be major changes that needs to be made because we cannot use refractive optics. It messes up those optics. So we have to make reflective optics. So instead of going through that glass, we can strike it and kind of use it like a mirror, right? So here's just some number with the depth of focus, 500 nanometer, smaller feature size. So we have limitations on how small lambda can be used in this case. Now, other issues with that, with projection lithography, a big benefit is that we can scale up the mask, so we can narrow down the features, we get sharper feature, but here we have to, instead of making 10x mask, we have to 1x mask. We have to make the actual mask at the smaller feature that we need, which is a challenge in itself, right? So in optical lithography, we make them 4x. So we demagnify, we kind of make the feature small to get sharp edges, right? So, but this has given us a major step up that we can have half pitch of 65 nanometer, which means we can bring many more devices close to each other. So which means in a unit area, we can now bring double the devices, almost double the devices, because we can make each device next to each other much more closely, right? So basic trade-off in one case is mask, that the mask can be made bigger and then can be shrunk. In other case, but the optics needs to be updated. In other case, the optics are good. We can still use the glass, but the mask needs to be made 1x. You cannot make smaller mask. All right. So this is so far the extension of UV. But now we're going to jump into direct writing. Direct writing, which starts with electron beam and ion beams, right? So before
So question,
yeah,
so let me get this straight. In photolithography, we first draw the shape on a piece of paper and then sort of like using chemicals we embed onto a
piece of paper.
disk. No, how does can't I'm sorry, getting it wrong. Sorry.
No, so a VLSI engineer would make the layout in a CAD software, right? So that layout is transferred into a mask. Mask is that glass plate. That was second or third slide,
Okay.
right? You wanna maybe take a screenshot of this slide, and we can discuss that at the end.
Okay.
All right? Yeah. So that's I just recapped this from previous module.
Okay.
All right. So now we'll go into something interesting now, which is e-beam or electron microscopes for that matter, because e-beam lithography or focused ion beam lithography or writing is a direct extension of scanning electron microscopes, SEM. Anybody has heard the word SEM before? Scanning electron microscope is a microscope in which we
Yes,
use
sir.
electrons instead of light, right? So if you think of a microscope, just like a desktop lab microscope, that's an optical microscope. We use light and we shine the sample and we look through lenses. But when we have to really, really zoom in, electron microscopes are used. And these have been around. They were invented in 1930s. And the first one was commercialized in 65. And now they make portable electron microscopes as well, which is like a briefcase. You can carry it around and you can open it anywhere and you can start imaging. It's a specialized piece of equipment. Here, we are not using light to shine the sample, right? In optical microscope, we shine it, right? But here we throw electrons at the sample. And we look at the electrons that in response to that throwing this electrons, we get some electrons that are emitted back from the sample. We capture those with detectors, and the time of flight of those electrons from the surface to the detector from different levels, we create an image using that information. All right. So that's basic principle of scanning electron microscope, where we would scan electron beam and we would get electrons that come out of that sample in response to that elastic collision of those electrons, and we capture those electrons, and that helps us create image of the surface. And there are two types of electron microscopes. One is where we throw the sample, and we like our samples to be conductive because we need to have enough electrons for the surface or for the features to be emitted back. But newer SEMs used at low vacuum, we can image now even biological molecules also, which may or may not be conductive. The other type is transmission electron microscope, TEM. We'll talk about the principle also very soon. But just remember, there are electron microscopes. We use electrons to shine. I'm using the word shine just to give an analogy to optical microscope. But what we do is we throw the beam, and in response, the material would emit back in SEM. In TEM, we make our sample very thin and we shine electron beam, and this beam is very tightly focused and electrons are traveling at very high speed. Those electrons transmit through the sample and we image at a plate on the other side. Now, in transmission electron microscope, historically, we have used that to see the diffraction pattern, to see the crystalline structure of the material, right? So electrons would diffract from every atom in that 3D lattice, and that they would be diffracting in a very fine predefined pattern because of their structure, and we can get the structure of the material from that. But now we use them to image things like carbon nanotubes, graphene. These are very thin samples, so we can see the electrons going through, and we can see these things in actually real time. So that's electron, brief introduction to electron microscopes and basic ones. So both of these microscopes, we operate them in vacuum. In vacuum, we pump out everything. So when we throw the electron, there is no scattering. There is no scattering with other material which may be floating around in the column, in the tube. So, but in this case now, for next generation lithography, so we coat the surface with a resist. In this case,
Sir, question.
All right.
Sir,
Hold on. In this case, we coat the surface with a material just like photoresist, but in this case, we call it E-beam resist. So we coat it, and then when we write electron, we control the beam to very precise X, Y direction. The resist undergoes changes, chemical changes, just like photoresist. And when we take it out, dip it in a developer, that pattern is transferred in the resist. Yes, Ahmed, go ahead.
So I was going to ask, we still need to use all this in a vacuum, or has it improved significantly? We do not require a
No, it's not required. We want to create vacuum, so our electron beam doesn't deflect with particles from air. Air has particles, right? Air has so many things moving around in it. We want to pump everything out. So when I strike my beam, it does not deflect of anything, any particles in the air.
So let's say the makers who use this, they need to wear like astronaut suits type things,
No.
or
So okay, you're right. So electron microscope, your sample goes inside the machine, it's sealed off. So electron microscope doesn't have to be in a clean room. It does not have to be in a clean room. It has to be in a clean lab. You don't want to have, okay, for electron microscopes, the requirements are slightly different. You think about it, when you are dealing with the very fine electron thin beam, even a person, if a person walks outside the door of the lab, the vibration of that walking can cause your beam to flicker. So these electron beam suites or labs are made, they have made these labs on platforms which have huge springs below. These are not look like normal labs, but their platforms, they are resting on big springs. So there is no vibration even from a person walking outside the lab. Why? Because we are dealing with very fine precision of that beam in the machine. But the vacuum is inside the machine. The outside can be, you don't need clean room. It has to be relatively clean because your sample that you have made inside the clean room and now you have to image it, you have to take it out, right? So you don't want your samples to get contaminated. So relatively clean place, but not clean room. All right. So now SEM principle, we have just got introduction. We'll look a little bit deeper in a couple of slides. So we throw electron beam and the resist gets those electrons, or ion beam is the same principle, but ion beam is slightly different because instead of using electron gun, we are using ion gun. When I say gun, it's not a gun, it's just this kind of a part of the machine which gives out very tightly focused electron beam. We call them electron gun or electron source. There are different ways we call them. All right, so the principle of E-beam lithography. So you have to see the parts which are shown. So we have the electron gun right at the top. And this is where we supply high voltage power. Electrons come out and we have these lenses. Now, in this case, we are not using optical lenses like we call, where we know lenses, right? On glasses, we have lenses. Lenses here, we have coils. So the electromagnetic field is used to adjust the beam, right? We can adjust the beam. It's basic principle of, what is that? Lenses law. So those beams we control, so we can direct the beam. We can make sure the beam stays tightly focused. Tightly focused, where it stays, the electrons stay very tightly controlled and they shoot down. In this column, we have what you call an amplifier, which means we are making them go faster. We are increasing their speed. And then we have a pattern generator, which would tell us how to move the beam. You see, it says DA converters, deflection amplifiers. Deflection, beam is coming. Hold on, just wait. Beam is coming. I want to deflect it to right. So it's like, this is my paper. Is the beam coming? How do I move? But this is not a pen, but this is a beam. So we have these coils. which will make this to go whichever way, so it can write the pattern that needs to be written. The pattern is written in the resist, E-beam resist, what we call in this case. So we can move the beam, or we can move the stage, the platform on which we have placed our wafer, right? So the both can be done. Question, Emmett.
And I was going to ask if this requires a computer, but it's written there. It is using a computer. Sorry.
Say it again.
I was going to say that I was going to ask if it uses a computer, but it's written there that it uses a computer, so it's sort of
all right. So you
insignificant.
all right.
Sir,
Say it, Emmett. Go ahead.
Sir, my question is that, sir, what is the meaning of forward sketching and back sketchings? Why, sir, it is the disadvantage?
A little bit physics, a little bit physics on that. So when an electron strikes an atom, it transfers its energy to the atom. It knocks off some atoms out of that. Some atoms some electrons that are pushed, knocked off, would come out of the surface. Some electrons would keep on going further. They would knock off and strike another atom. They would cause more electrons from the next atom to start moving and get knocked off. So it's depending on which phenomena is causing that electron to move. We call some backscattered, some forward scattered. So that's just a little bit more into the dynamics of electron scattering, right? So now in SEM, we use both kind of electrons. We look backscattered electrons, and there are 2-3 types that we look at. So they all give us the electrons that come out of the surface. They all give us an image of, but that's for SEM. We're talking about E-beam lithography. We're not looking at, yes, we are looking at the sample, but here goal is to use that beam to write a pattern, right? So we use the focus beam of electron to draw custom shapes on the surface, which is covered with the E-beam resist, right? So now again, same thing, exposed, not exposed. So exposed area will get washed away, and not exposed will stay. You take a next step to do your development, and whatever next step is, maybe etching, maybe doping, maybe deposition, right? The standard things. All right, another question. I heard some.
Sir, it's not easy method, sir. It's so complex, sir.
E-beam
like
writing?
Heating. Yeah.
Oh, the scattering, electron scattering, or
yes, scattering, sir. Scattering,
yeah.
Sir. Forward scattering in back.
I'm saying it's, yeah. That's why I'm not going into depth of that. I'm not going into depth of the electron scattering process. Right? So now here again, there are different varieties. So if you have a low resolution system, the source of electrons, we use thermionic sources and other sources. So there are the element that's used in the electron gun that defines the price and the focus and the quality of electrons we would get. So we call them based on the element that used. So lanthanum hexaboride, we call it lab 6, La lanthanum, B boron 6, lab 6 element, or lanthanum hexaboride. But these high resolution is where we call another kind of source. We call it field electron emission source. They use tungsten and zirconia, I think ZrO2, zirconia material. So depending on what kind of application, what is the how tight beam we want, and what kind of resolution we need, we use different sources, right? Now, ion beam lithography is same process, but instead of using electrons, we are using ions. Now, ions is charged atom. So ions are definitely bigger, fatter, right? So if they are fatter, which means it will be hard to make or write smaller features with them relative to E-beam lithography, right? But the benefit is that they can write easily. You can image things much better in focused ion beam. So we call the machine focused ion beam. We short it, we call it FIB. So if you see the word written FIB somewhere, just know that this means focused ion beam machine, which can be used for imaging, and which can be used for ion beam writing. I'm not saying lithography, I'm saying writing, because with ion beams, yes, we can do coating with resist and write and resist, but we can sculpt the material. You know, sculptor people who take metal and remove metal from different places and make, I don't know, statues or whatnot. So with ion beam, we can remove the material, bulk material. We can remove silicon for that matter. So ion beam can be used to have much higher energy. So it can deposit much more energy in a localized area than electron. But because they're big, they're fat, they cannot go too deep. But electrons can go deep in the resist. So that has its own pluses and its own minuses. If I were to compare, I would compare this right side figure. So if you see electron would can go deeper, but they would cause a flood of secondary electrons, which means they can result into a bigger feature because they can go too deep. Benefit is they can go deep, but the disadvantage is they can result into secondary electrons. Light ions can go deep, right? But not as deep as electrons, which means they can create features. But between heavy ion and light ion, again, heavy ions would get arrested. All it takes is atomic number, right? So bigger atomic number being bigger atom, big heavy ion. You take smaller atom, get its ion, that's light ion, right? So we use both, depending on what is the small feature we want to make. If it's within the limit range of heavy ion, I will use heavy ion because it's easy to deal with that and easy to make my features. All right. Now, when you say light ion and heavy ion, they have their own guns. For heavy ions, we use gallium. For light ions, there are other materials which we use. I'm forgetting the names. I had the names. So, but there are different sources of ions that we would use for different applications. All right. So far, so good. Next generation lithography. So the idea is, how can we make things smaller, but with high throughput? An application for self-assembly, right? So we put, self-assembly. We put molecules, we want to order them. This a paper, simple example of using E-beam lithography. Put photoresist. It should be called E-beam resist. It shouldn't be called photoresist, but they call it a photoresist. On gold, we write pattern electrons, which means we do the development, we remove wherever the resist was, and we got a pattern. So we put it in some molecule which may have thiol, sulfahydryl end group, which binds to gold. So you get those molecules everywhere, but guess what? This portion is going to go away. So which means the molecules that land here are going to get washed away. So when I remove my resist completely, I get a pattern made with molecules. So we can write ultimately a whole chip with molecules that we want. Think about DNA chip that we talked about, right? So we can place very small droplets, very small areas of specific gene that we are looking for, probe molecules. Remember that with E-beam lithography. Now, here it is showing that the next step they put red molecule. So red molecule is probably with the thing which is not supposed to bind to whatever we are looking for. So the blue is is making the feature, and then the red is another molecule that's placed on the same chip, right? Just a basic example. I just took that part where it showed highlighted E-beam lithography. More examples of E-beam writing. These are, you can see the scale bars, how small they are. So the first one, A, is backscattered electron image. So in this case, they have turned on the backscattered electron detector to see zinc oxide patterns on silicon dioxide substrate. Anneal that air, they made annealing is a temperature cycling. B is showing secondary electron image. So in this case, backscattered detector is off, secondary electron detector is on. Before annealing, they're showing this is the thickness, 140 nanometers. So annealing is, again, now in third one, they show that this is secondary electron image after annealing. So we see that feature size has shrunk from 140 nanometers become 50 nanometer, right? And the fourth one is then, again, comparing the thickness of anneal pattern over a large area. So all examples of using a direct writing of E-beam, and you can write down to 50 nanometers with these techniques. More examples of this. Now, it's hard to see the what do you call the scale bar, but I can read. This is they have covered. This is 10 micrometer scale bar. So you can see small features here. This is 2 micrometer. Yeah, this bad. But the idea is we can make very interesting features. You're not just confined to straight lines or squares or just a circle. You can make concentric circles, you can make steps. So many, many different things can be written with E-beam lithography. We have worked with E-beam lithography as well. So we have made nano electrodes to detect molecules, DNA molecules, proteins, biomarkers, cancer biomarkers for that matter. So this right-hand lower picture is something that I made. So here these gold features is they're about 10 to 15 nanometer apart. So we were using it for a biosensor for cancer biomarkers, cancer-related. There is a growth factor. There is a molecule that goes up. So E-beam lithography, you can directly write the pattern or the gap. The Merriam and Tennant, there's one from their lab also. It shows a 4 nanometer gap if you look at this top right-hand side picture. Advantage, amazingly small features. You have flexibility in design that you can make. You can make so many things on so many variety of substrates, so many wafers, plastics. You can put it on anything. But disadvantage are the biggest is it's a serial process. You have to make one, you have to take one beam and you can only write it so fast, right? So there's a limitation of how fast you can go, which means throughput goes down, cost goes up, defects cannot be detected easily while you are doing it because you are writing, it's going to finish writing the whole chip and then you can take a look. The features are too small. We generally try to do that. We have big alignment marks because next step may be a bigger thing. So you write big alignment marks, which means you're going to spend more time in writing alignment marks with that as well. All right. So there are issues and challenges with E-beam lithography. So microscopes, optical microscopes that we know, we use light. Electron microscopes, we use electron beam. Depending on whether we are looking at scattered electron or we are looking at electrons passing through a sample and you are imaging the image on the other side, there are two types, TEM and SEM, right? And within TEM and SEM, we use SEM idea to do E-beam lithography. And similar way, we have another machine called FIB. FIB is what we use to write images or patterns using ions.